Well, hi everyone. It's really great to be back here on the Remakers. We're at a time in Australia and well, the world really, where the rise of the far right is getting a lot of attention. I don't know about you, but in the last sort of few weeks, every email I've had in my inbox from any organisation has been talking about the increasing popularity of a particular right-wing party and what that might mean. So I'm really lucky today to be talking with Mario Peucker, not so much about the specifics of this moment, but really about his bigger picture understandings of the conditions that might help or hinder the growth of far right groups. So Mario is an associate professor at Victoria University. He works qualitatively and quantitatively in the research space on radical political movements and dissent, community activism, and inclusion-exclusion dynamics, which I'm interested to understand what those words mean, both in Europe and Australia. He's guided by a strong emphasis on interdisciplinary, multi-stakeholder collaboration and real-life impact, which I think is always such an important thing for people to talk about. How does this translate to the real world? And his current research, as I understand it, focuses mainly on place-based anti-racism and on far-right political movements. Mario is also the author of a book called Democracy Strikes Back, Understanding and Countering the Rise of the Far Right, which was published in 2024. And it's a book I've only recently come across and only recently read. And I found it actually incredibly helpful for thinking about the social context, the social context that lay the groundwork that enable or disable the rise of far right politics and communities, but not only the conditions that enable them, but what we might do in response and how we might change those preconditions. So Mario, it's so wonderful to have you here.
Thanks, Emily.
And so you've spent most of your career researching and thinking about the far right and how to counter it. And what you've written, like I said, I think is just incredibly important and really timely book. Before we kind of go into the details of the book, I'm kind of keen to hear like, why do you do this work, or how did you come to do this work? Because it's big work.
It is, yeah, it is, and it's been with me for many, many years. And as you may be able to tell by my accent, I'm not originally from Australia, so I'm from Germany, and I started my, maybe call it sort of academic career or path in over there in Germany at a research institute where in 2002 roughly. Um, and the work focused on what Australia would call multiculturalism, or in Europe it would be called migrant integration,
Right.
immigration and integration. And racism was always part of that, as was seen in a very problematic way, I would now say, as purely as a hindrance to integration. It's obviously much more like systematic and broader, but that's how I came across. And right-wing extremism was part of that, the way we looked at this as a specific manifestation of racism. I think we have to be careful in not to conflate racism with far-right extremism. Once it's a political ideology, the other thing is a system historically rooted, and there are obviously big differences, but there is also an overlap. And I found it really interesting when I came to Australia in 2010, 2011. Initially, there was basically no work being done on far-right extremism in Australia. And then all the extremism work was in sort of, I don't even know how to call it, the jihadist,
Mm.
ISIS-inspired violent extremism. And I never did any work in that space, and I don't claim any expertise at all in that area. But it only in the mid 2010s, or in the second half of the 2010s, there was a sort of more academic and then political and public interest in far right extremism in Australia, and that's where I then was able, hopefully, to tap into my previous experiences overseas. Although the framing is very different, and maybe we get a chance to talk about this later on. The framing of far right extremism is quite different in Germany compared to Australia. But this is where I then found an opportunity to continue this kind of work in Australia. So it came out of this multicultural space, but it is much broader. And now I'm particularly the last 7, 8 years more interested in sort of the conditions that you mentioned before, the social conditions that make these or that make people vulnerable to far-right extremism. So I'm not really a terrorism expert. I don't see myself as a person who does sort of the violence and the pointy end of all this. It's more out of the social environment within which this is occurring at the moment and has been.
When we've spoken previously, not on the podcast, I was really struck by you talked about, there's the kind of violent extremism that has a real physical violence, but then a lot of what you seem to be talking about is also the real risks of extremism or the far right to democracy. And
Yeah.
so it's much, like you say, it's less sort of pointy, less bound in time. It's a much slower burn crisis, which I think we often pay less attention to. Which, I mean, your book has got democracy in the title, and the way that you link democracy to the far right. So maybe now's the time to tell us a bit about that book.
Yeah, I mean, just in response to what you just said, I think that this is one of the key differences when that violent extremism in Australia is primarily framed as an issue of political violence. And that's obviously a very important dimension. And it comes out of a space where we spoke about ISIS attacks and jihadist extremism and violent extremism. And I acknowledge that for the jihadist space, violence was the primary problem. So we had attacks, but there was never really a risk that jihadist, don't want to even call it movement, but groups would undermine the democratic fabric of Australia. There was never a risk there. But I think it's quite different in the far-right extremism or radicalism space, because I think that there is a genuine risk to the socio-political structures that shape our lives, actually. So that's why I bring in this sort of democracy angle, which I think is not particularly prevalent. It's becoming more sort of more part of the conversation about extremism, far-right extremism, but it's not a particularly central element to that. But it is the key defining factor in a way in Germany, for example, where there's the history obviously makes it is quite different, where Hitler rose to power through democratic channels in a democratic context, and the and Germany, modern Germany was built on one of the premises was to not allow this to happen again. Like, how can we make a democracy strong enough to defend its internal enemies in a way? So the democracy is a big factor in assessing and approaching far-right extremism or other form of extremism, especially far-right. Whereas in Australia, it's the focus on violence. And I think that's where I think there's one of the weaknesses where the book is trying to address, coming from like trying to tap into their experiences from overseas as well. So the book is not looking at the pointy end of violent extremism or far-right extremist groups, but it looks at how far-right extremism is much more embedded in our current and historical structures in society and creates and this creates sort of susceptibilities to far-right narratives and messaging that we don't want to see, because we have this urge in Australia especially, but I mean, I would say we're talking about Australia, so I don't compare it to other countries. But there's an urge to put far-right extremism with the label of extremism in a little box, and then the broader society doesn't have to deal with it. It's something that's sort of that exists on the fringes and on the margins. And of course, certain elements of far-right extremist groups do politically exist on the margin, but the susceptibility is across society, and that's where I think we have to look. It hurts, and it's something that we look into in the mirror when we look at the vulnerability to far-right extremism and don't point fingers. And I think that's the starting point for a new way of approaching it and acknowledging and defining the problem more broadly rather than as a fringe issue that sort of some extremism experts and practitioners have to deal with. It's a societal issue where it comes.
Can you give some examples of what that susceptibility looks like? Because I found that really powerful, that reframing. I think First Nations people of color have been kind of yelling about this for some time, but that the way that, yeah, like you say, these kind of some preconditions for this are just part of our ordinary life, and that's very confronting.
So in a way, that's the first half of the whole book, the question that you're asking. So um, I see sort of three main pillars or three main arguments. The first one is, I just name them briefly. The first one is that there's an ideological susceptibility to far-right extremist narratives. We could, the way far-right extremism is defined is through um, anti-establishment, anti-government, anti-democratic attitudes, but then also nationalism and a form of a sort of an exclusive nationalism with racist elements and in-group, out-group boundaries where certain groups are not culturally defined or often more increasingly also racially defined. Who is the nation that should be kept pure or not kept but become pure again.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
what I found that is that when we look at many different surveys, representative population surveys, we see that many of those ideological markers are actually not majority, but it is still quite widespread. So we see 15 or 20% who say we need strong leaders and who doesn't have to deal with parliament. We don't need a. So there's quite some authoritarian attitudes in society, and that applies to other countries as well. We see racist attitudes are high, exclusionary ideas about anti-Muslim attitudes, anti-black narrative. So these are all not as fringe as far-right extremism seems to suggest it is. So there's a quite a susceptibility pool that where ideological mindsets are quite aligned with some far-right extremist ideologies. So that's the ideology pillar. The other one is I named those briefly, and we can talk about this in more detail. The second one is that a common argument in what makes people vulnerable to extremism, any form, but in our case, far-right extremism, is some form of grievances where people feel they are treated in a way that they don't deserve to be treated. There's injustice, they deserve a certain status or recognition that they don't have anymore. In the far-right context, it's often described as sort of nostalgic deprivation, where people say, well, I used to be in control. I used to be in control of what it means to be Australian, what the Australian story is, and now I'm not anymore because I lost I would say, a slither of my privilege, but that's not how it's perceived. So the grievances is one pillar, and the other one is, and grievances are common. We all have our grievances, and many of us would have some form of grievances that are in some ways aligned to that. And the second pillar, or together with the ideology, the third one is that the basic human need for social connectedness, belonging, recognition, social worth in some way. So everyone has that. So it's really not something that we only see at the fringes. And our society gives us less opportunities these days in the last, well, you could go to say the last 5 years after COVID, but you could go also back to the the last few decades, less opportunities to find those opportunities where we connect and find this social worth and recognition in a pro-social environment through volunteering, through working in the community, at work. We have loneliness rates are gone up enormously, often referred to as epidemic. So there's a new scope of vulnerability because people look for social connectedness and a recognition that they don't seem to, or they struggle finding that in a positive democratic environment. And then it's very easy to sort of swoop in and pretend to offer that in a far-right extremist groups because they are close-knit social connection there. There's purpose. The purpose is bizarre for me personally, but it is purpose. It is a really big purpose, like saving your race. Like this is like really big stuff. And some people feel like this is what they've been looking for, or they get sucked into because they find this kind of social worth in those groups. So these three pillars, the ideological predisposition that I would say, roughly speaking, maybe 20% of the population would fall under, depending on how we measure it. Then grievances that we all have, economic, cultural, different grievances. And then this urge to find connectedness and social recognition. And all those three pillars together create sort of my diagnosis of susceptibility to far-right extremism.
Yeah, I think one of the things you talk about in your book, and maybe in one of the articles, which we'll link to in the show notes, but is that, say with the first one, the ideological susceptibility, that people might hold certain beliefs, but it doesn't necessarily lead to that, leading to a practice of belonging to the far right. Is that correct?
That's right. I mean, we have to be careful that we don't put everyone who has anti-immigration, strong nationalist or anti-establishment, anti-government views to put them in the far-right extremism basket. That's a big risk. That doesn't define. We would cast the net way too wide if we did that. Extremism is really like that's just the ideological markers. There are lots of other factors that play into that, but it's certainly true that it makes you more vulnerable to their narratives, to their messaging, to their recruitment, and maybe like more open to join, or less deterred at least, or more less deterred to join. And in some far-right extremist groups in Australia, they would not even want anyone who doesn't already hold those views. So that's a really important point to make, that even if you wanted to join a far-right group and you don't hold those views, you would not even be welcome in there. That doesn't apply to all far-right extremist groups, but to some it does.
I finding that that human need for social connection. I mean, there's so much in that
Yeah.
particular pillar that I want to unpack, but one of the things that always kind of boggles my brain a bit is that we talk about, there's a saving your race or whatever big contribution you think you can make, even if it's completely wacky to me. We have some really big key issues we could all be working on at the
Yeah.
moment, like climate change, for example. And I think in your book you also talk about, I may have this incorrect, but that a key marker of the far right is a belief in conspiracy theories, or that something about that. And I find that very interesting too, because if you dig down into how our world actually works, there's a whole lot of very powerful people pulling strings in a way that really, actually, if you dig down, you're like, well, that is a real conspiracy. So
Mm.
it's close, it's close. We've got this very real issue of climate that we could have a collective around, and we've got these very real hidden power structures that kind of could step in to be the real conspiracy, but we're not. What's going on there?
Yeah, I agree that conspiratorial thinking is a key element because it doesn't require facts. So the facts are selectively chosen. It's not that it's all irrational, but it's just selective. But it also provides, and I think that's the key, it provides a target. It provides, it points the finger. Someone is responsible for that. And when we talk about the sort of a amorphous conspiracy around climate change, like big companies or pharmaceutical companies in other ways, like there is some form of something is going on. But if the easier we make that, if we say it is that group, it's the George Soros, it is this, then it's a very clear-cut black and white thinking that resonates a lot with far-right extremist sort of mentality and mindset. So you don't only identify the problem, but you also find an alleged um, target that is to be blamed for this. And obviously, highly problematically, this is then often framed in anti-Semitic ways, where it's the Jewish elite. This is a very common, like a global cabal, either explicitly called Jewish or with some subtle or not so subtle references made clear that this refers to some Jewish conspiracy. So that's really problematic. And it's a very strong current that binds most far-right extremist groups together. But I mean, you're right. I mean, there is a lot of reason to be angry. And I recently read this book again, Angrynomics, where it refers more to the economic crisis in the 2000s. We should be angry. We should be annoyed and frustrated. And we should speak out about it. But they make the differentiation between, so they call it public anger that leads to some action, and there is nothing wrong with this. Maybe we need more of that. But does it lead to moral outrage that targets the actual problem, or does it manifest in tribal rage. So that's more outrage
Mm.
tribal rage. And the tribal rage is where it scapegoats people that are not really to be blamed for this. Like we see that in the immigration debate. It's you can have conversations about the failing infrastructure and house. That's all legitimate and important. But is it really so simple that we blame a certain group for that?
Mm.
Like, I mean, that's as an example, international students live primarily in student accommodation, so but we find a scapegoat, and then it becomes tribal rage that can pull people in.
Mm.
And it may be more, it might offer more sort of emotional energy if you have a target that you can, unload your anger. Um, that goes beyond just the government, because
Mm.
that's one thing but if you can point fingers, and that seems to be appealing to some people.
Mm. I think that you just said something then about people being rightfully angry, but they're kind of being nowhere for that anger. And I'm thinking about the far right sounds like it offers a home for anger, not just a place but a home, a sense of belonging and connection, and righteousness and glory, but kind of almost personal security because it gives you an identity and a framework. And I remember reading in Naomi Klein's book Doppelganger, she talks about when the pandemic hit, Naomi Wolf, who became very right wing, went to New York, and she said, the New Yorkers are walking around with this emptiness, like their life has been drained from them. It must have been the vaccines.
Ah,
And Naomi Klein's response was, the left went very hard on that and came down very there was a lot of dismissal of people's fears of vaccines. And she said, Naomi Wolf was kind of right in that people were probably looking pretty shell shocked because there's this traumatic global pandemic. And yet there was no space offered. She got she misdiagnosed it, but there was no space for that discussion of fear. And that's something you talk about in the book too, about we're losing these spaces for people to bring grievances to be heard, to kind of be aired, and then not just locked into these far right spaces. Can you talk a bit more about that?
think there's, I mean, the example of the COVID pandemic and then the anti-lockdown protests is a particularly illustrative example, but we see that all the time. We also see it in environmental movements and
Mm.
protests, and um, so the space is shrinking for this kind of dissenting views. And I understand that during the lockdown, there were sort of material and regulatory elements around public health,
Mm.
but it was not managed from those people in government or those people in decision-making powers, and I include sort of influential positions in education, in the media, and
Mm.
so on, to really acknowledge the pain and the concerns.
Mm.
It was just not acknowledged. Um,
Mm.
Names like selfish. Probably the worst one was when anti-lockdown protesters were described as baby Nazis by a politician.
Mm.
So it doesn't. I I understand that was frustration, but this is not in a context where trust in government is already not particularly high. I understand that people lose faith in government as a democratic representation of the people. Like, where's my voice? Why can I not say this?
Mm.
The same thing happens in smaller contexts about concerns about immigration. How do we open up those conversations? I'm not saying this is an easy task,
Mm.
but if we don't, then it's going to be instrumentalized and used and exploited by people who are not really interested in the solution. I remember when we attended lots of far right rallies before the pandemic, and I always thought there are so many. There was one about increasing crime rates, or allegedly increasing crime rates, and many people were there who were genuinely concerned about the increase in crime. I remember one guy was from Phillip Island. He has never had any experience with crime, but he just felt
Mm.
that he wanted to express that he is concerned, but he
Mm.
was put in a far right extremism box because the protest was organized by them. And I always wondered if if we wanted to ask people if they really want to do something
Mm.
constructively to change the issues that they are worried about, that would drive a wedge between those who use this as an instrument for mobilization, like far-right extremist groups, and those who are really concerned.
Mm.
Um, the far-right extremist groups who organize that don't want this crime rate to go down. They
Yeah.
want it to go up.
Yeah.
But many people in there want it to go down, and there's a potential friction in that movement, and we just look at it as a far-right extremism movement. And the same happened in the pandemic, in the lockdown protests. It was easily basically took the far-right extremist groups took ownership of that. They said that it
Mm.
was our protest, and the media actually described it as a far-right protest, although it wasn't. So it was
Mm.
really being counterproductive because it shrunk the space for people to express without being put in a box, in
Mm.
being associated with far-right extremist groups. They never wanted to, but many then said, "Well, if you put me in that box, then I'm happy to do that because they're the only ones who really listen." So
Mm.
that's the concern, that people actually shift away from legitimate, maybe confrontational protesting that falls on deaf ears into spaces where they don't have a great level of political efficacy, but at least they feel heard and
Yeah.
listened in those groups. And we saw that in the mosque conflict in Bendigo, for example, where people just said, well, if the council doesn't listen to us, then we find someone else who is going to listen. And that was these are the predecessors of the neo-Nazi groups that we have now. So quite serious stuff. Yeah.
Mm. I think it was the Bendigo example in the book. You talked about one guy who was very concerned about the mosque being
Mhm.
built. He went to the council, and the council just kind of told him to bugger off. And so he didn't know what to do with himself, so he ranted online on Facebook, and then far right groups kind of picked him up, and it was a way of recruiting. He wasn't seeking to be a far right person, but like you said, that was the only place he got heard.
Yeah, that happens often, and I'm not saying that Bendigo was particularly bad. It was just that they followed
Yeah.
consultation procedures, and there was just no space for this. So there was no, it was a process that was followed, and the process allowed for concerns around parking, noise pollution, all this stuff, but it didn't allow for expressing conspiratorial Islamophobic fears as real as they were. Um, and that's a common feature that we see, that people end up in far right spaces because they feel like there was no other channel for them to express that. They didn't go there first, but there was just no
Mm.
alternative for them then. So one of the challenges is how to open up those spaces, without
Mm.
endorsing
Mm.
that we don't want to hear. So I mean, I always bring up that example that came up out of one of the studies there. There's a youth club. One guy makes racist comments about First Nations people. What's going to happen to this guy? Are we going to kick him out of the youth club? And I think most youth workers wouldn't do that. They would engage and have a conversation. So on that small scale level, we know how to do that, and
Mm.
youth workers are experts in this. But we haven't really found a way to do that on a political scale, on a broader
Mm.
scale. I think local governments are really well positioned to explore new alternatives, um, engage with concerned, problematic voices without the public profiling around it, without the endorsement,
Mm.
but allowing a space where they can be heard and being discussed outside the usual channels. I think that's local governments are better placed, and then there are civil society organizations that are not utilized enough or not involved in this enough because of resourcing questions. So that's a big potential that we are missing, to include more civil societies voices in that.
Mm. Well, kind of two follow-up questions for this. I feel like we could go down this particular path for a long time, but I'm not sure if it was Bendigo or a different example, but you wrote about a community that responded to particular incidences of racism, I think it was, by not going sort of hard head to head against the group, but by offering alternative spaces where people could feel connected. Can you? I
So
can't
yeah,
remember the
that was
example.
a reference to, I think that's the reference to Bendigo, where the the mosque conflict escalated. Far-right extremist groups capitalized, had rallies there, was really was getting in a direction where the council couldn't do anything because the council had lost any sort of level of trust or communication with the anti-mosque movement. So it became really hard for the majority of people in Bendigo who were actually not, well, who were in favor of the mosque, or at least not against it, to even speak about it. So the public climate
Mm.
was dominated by, a loud minority, you could say.
Mm.
Uh, Not a super small minority, but still a minority. And no one dared speak out in favor of the mosque. And that only
Mm.
changed when local business owners and community organizations said we've had enough because this is not looking, it's not looking good for us. We need tourism, we need, there are many
Mm.
different reasons, of humanitarian reasons, but also uh,
Mm.
economic reasons, whatever the reasons were. And they said we have to do something. And they created sort of um, a campaign, Believe in Bendigo, it was called, with the color yellow, and they had festivals without mentioning the mosque itself or the anti-mosque camp. They just created an environment where people found it's safe again to speak
Mm.
for diversity and in favor of the mosque. And that was only possible because it was a civil society grassroots movement.
Yeah.
The council had no, at this time, I mean, lots has changed since then, but at that point they had lost all credibility in those most critical Islamophobic, whatever you want to call them, spaces and communities. So it had to be the community that pushed back. And we've seen that in many other cases across Melbourne as well. The grandmas knitting for refugees when the far-right extremist groups tried to organize a rally against sort of refugees coming to that suburb. Well, they just took it up on themselves, and they demonstrated what civil society really stands for, and that took oxygen away from the mobilization for far-right extremism. So we don't use that enough.
Mm.
The structures are not as well developed in Australia compared to other places where mobilization is much easier. In
Mm.
Germany, there's a far-right event planned, and all of a sudden you have 30 civil society organizations that can mobilize a counter event within 3 days. And that's something that,
Mm.
because they're used to it and they've done it before, but it's not quite there yet in Australia.
How do we, like, I'm having trouble working out as well what this line is because, on the one hand, I think what you're saying is we need to be really careful about not lumping everybody who turns up to a particular protest as being far right or Nazis because they might be turning up because they're worried about
Yeah.
a perception of crime increase.
Yeah.
And so on the one hand, going hard against that and saying you're all terrible people, you're all Nazis, is really problematic because people can't air their grievances and we can't hear actually what's the real fear here. Oh, your real fear is X, Y, Z.
Mhm.
And then at the same time, you're saying a response is these counter protests. And is it right in what you're saying that the way it's having people on the ground to respond, but it's almost more having people on the ground to respond with another offering rather than with a hard pushback? Is that
Probably. Well, in some ways, that's a good way. So in that Bendigo example, it was an explicit and deliberate decision to not um, basically highlight the problems in the city, but highlight the positives, and then hope that there's a flow-on effect on the others. And in others, it's different. In other cases, it was a clearly directed counter protest, but the counter protest or the counter movements are um, overseas. It's a broad coalition that does that usually. Whereas in what we haven't seen that in Australia in recent. Oh well, we have. So it's often organized from a more, and I'm not saying this in a negative way. From a more radical left political groups, like they they mobilize, and then it looks like two extremes are mobilizing against each other, which is not really the point, because the substance of the conflict is something that should make it easy for most of us to position us on against sort of an exclusionary um, in a way a racist agenda. Um, but it because there are not many organizations that that join those counter movements, it looks like there are two extreme sides, and that's why the
Mm,
media then presents as if it's both sides are problematic or whatever. But we should look at the issues that we are talking about. I mean, is racializing crime really helping us? Is it reflecting reality, or is it just um, used as a tool for an agenda that is actually much bigger, where it's
mm,
about the white race and white Australia,
mm,
and not so
mm,
much about crime reduction.
mm. Yeah, I mean, there's so much there, isn't it? Because on the one hand, it's very simple. Like, I kind of always think is like, don't be a dickhead is really the base level, um, but we get, like you say, we get really easily manipulated by the media, by far right groups who want to claim us, by people who are very strongly standing up against something, but perhaps then lumping a whole lot of people in a box they're not, they've accidentally found themselves in, and then they cling to. Another example that I found quite amazing from the book was, I think you're referencing somebody else's research, but some guy in Scandinavia somewhere saying, look, I joined for the belonging. It could have been a skateboard club. It just
Yeah,
happened to be a far right group. Like that to me is a shocking
yeah.
failure of our society to
Yeah.
allow people to belong.
Yeah, then I mean, I asked then sort of in a way sort of pointedly said where are the skateboard clubs? And it's like a funny question when we talk about countering violent extremism and this where's the skateboard club? But in a way, this is where we need to go, where we see
Mm,
the vulnerabilities sit where where infrastructure collapses.
mm,
We've seen that in the 90s in Germany, for example, in the eastern parts of Germany, there were no sporting clubs anymore. So but there was a need for that. So far-right extremist groups set up their own sporting clubs.
oof,
So it's of course they would do that. I mean, we are not fully there, or not on the same scale, at least in Australia. But if spaces for that fulfill the need that people have, social connectedness, belonging, be it through sport, whatever it is, if we take this, if those spaces diminish, the needs don't diminish. The needs are
mm,
still there, and then you find it somewhere else, and then
mm,
it's the local. We saw that in a regional area in turn. Then it's a local gym that is run by a far right extremist guy, and then he offers, and then people go there not because necessarily
mm,
because they are ideologically aligned, but often we think that people step into far right spaces because they have a political agenda. That happens sometimes, and I don't want to quantify what's more important or not, but and less, but often it's the social connectedness, and often it's an interplay between different things that
mm.
pulls people in. And as you said, the example with um, he was just looking for somewhere to hang out and to belong, and it just happened to be that white nationalist group.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because it means that we also have to expand our definition of political action. I think, that starting a gym without a political slogan on the front, just a gym, but a gym where people are kind and inclusive and, share a politics of equality. That, as I think you called it, what do you say? We've got a vulnerability sits where infrastructure collapses. And so, how do we also start to kind of bring into the story opening a gym that's inclusive is a really important piece of infrastructure against the far right, and it's pro-democratic infrastructure. But it's I always think about it's not the kind of glorious undies on the outside superhero response. It's a very quiet
Yeah.
under the radar essential foundation.
And the important thing is that by opening a gym or opening up, I mean, it's a question of urban planning in many ways
Mm,
as well. So how do we plan an open space where people then can either walk the dog or connect through it? Do we put benches up that people can sit down? Is there an opportunity for kids to come? Is there lighting so in winter they can go there after, once it's dark, they can still play basketball there? How do we set up those spaces?
mm,
And if you say this is part of how we counter violent extremism, everyone's going to laugh because they say, well, what
mm,
are you talking about?
mm.
But and that's fine. People can laugh, but
Yeah.
what's important is that we are not countering. This is not something we do in order to counter
Mm,
violent extremism. This is something because it has lots of positive social effect.
mm,
It has effect on mental health, suicide rates. I would say domestic violence. Criminal crime rates. All those things are affected by those mechanisms. But we don't, the way that governance and our departments are structured, it has to be either crime prevention or it has to be mental health intervention. And those really important interventions that cut across all of this, they get sometimes lost a little bit because they are not seen in their holisticness or in the breadth of the positive effects that they would have. Why would you invest if it's only about crime reduction? Well, it is not only about crime reduction. This is preventing violent extremism. This is about mental health. This is about, there are lots of different things that it can contribute to. But we don't, the way our universities, our governments are structured is always in this sort of these pillars that don't really see that our social lives don't live in pillars. We don't, it unfolds across those different pillars. Health affects education, education affects employment, employment affects crime rate, like all these things are really closely connected. But so we have to find a way to see that and approach it in a more holistic way.
I feel like we're going to need to start a club of like connection is cool because we've done a lot of work in the kind of disaster space. And so we did some work on the public good and the three key things of infrastructure of public good that people told us they wanted was infrastructure of care, connection and contribution, which I think quite interestingly maps quite closely to some of what you're talking about. And in the disaster space, we know that communities that are connected to each other, like lives are saved because of connection in a disaster. And that in itself is important, but also, like you say, living in a well-connected community is just nice. Like we can have this nice life and it's good prevention and it's good response. So it's prevention. It's also allows us to mobilize, and it also means now is right now. And it's crazy to me that we don't prioritize this because it's in some ways it seems very simple and very easy.
Yeah. I think that the local context is really such a crucial element, and there's an increasing acknowledgement in local government that they have a broader remit, obviously beyond the traditional, what is it, the three R's, the rubbish and
rates or something. Yep, the bins. Yep.
So there's an acknowledgement. It's even enshrined in legislation. We know that local councils have, but there's also again a pushback against this in parts of the communities that don't want that. They think you should go back to those basics, but that pushback is, we have to deal with that pushback because ultimately everyone benefits from that. So I really think that the local focus is key because that's where the local knowledge sits. That's where you mobilize people. I often think about, it seems completely unrelated, but on the way to school, there's one road crossing that is dangerous. It seems like so the local communities are mobilizing to push for a pedestrian crossing. No one cares whether you are sort of anti-immigration or you're pro-immigration or whatever your background is. People want this to make their kids' way to school safer. If we find those common concerns, that's what brings people together. And then our ideological polarization still exists, but it is not so salient in everyday life anymore. Having a community garden where people can come together, where people can share, where people from overseas have different cultural practices where they can share. Everyone benefits. It's not a zero-sum game. It's just something where there is a lot that can be done on the local level, and that doesn't mean that federal and state is not also responsible for facilitating that, but in a different role. It's more as a facilitator, as resourcing. But locally is where we live, and this is where we find the connectedness that we are looking for.
And it's interesting because you talk about, with the road crossing, that's a practice of democracy. It's a practice of working together. It's a practice of coming up against the kind of more formal systems. And, there's Robert Putnam's work on social capital. And then there's other, I think her name is Theda Skocpol. And she talks about, one of the things that we have lost are organizations that people practice democracy in but don't have a particular political label on them. And I think that's a really interesting thing too. And again, it's a bit like having to do the work without getting the label of glorious political work,
Yeah.
where we do just practice like how do we make decisions together? How do whether it's deciding what color to paint the wall or whether to change a policy, So I think that it's an interesting link there to what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, like, many
Yeah.
things have become political, so I'm not even sure. I mean, out of feminism, the private is political. So, I mean, I'm not sure where to
Mm,
draw the line. In a way, you would think that doing something about the climate crisis, it should not be a political issue. I mean,
mm,
it affects all of us equally in a way. So
mm,
how has this become a political issue? Um,
mm.
you could also say um, military interventions and wars, and this is a humanitarian human rights issue that shouldn't be a political issue, but somehow we have ended up in a space where almost everything is politicized.
Yeah,
Um,
it's weaponized in the party political and in the label political.
but
Yeah.
locally, that we don't have that as much as we have that on the state or federal or even global level. So in a local level, people care just more about where their life unfolds,
Mm,
and the
mm,
common concerns and the common goals are much more. It's much more easy. It's much easier to find a common denominator across different ideological mindsets in the local context. I always bring up the example with public safety. Everyone wants to live in a publicly
mm,
in a space that it feels safe. But
mm,
when I speak to people from African background, they don't feel safe because of the constant racist assault that they and
mm,
abuse that they
mm,
do on the street. And other people feel not safe because of home invasion or car checking.
mm.
The need is the same. We all want to
Yeah.
feel safe in our environment. So I'm not sure how we can do that, but it feels like there's a potential to start with that, the common
Mm,
for safety,
mm, mm.
and build ways to do that together.
And I think that, I mean, that to me is so important. That's a lot of what we've done with Australia Remade is like, what is it that we want? If we boil it all down, we want to spend time with our family. We want to be safe. And then what does that look like and what does that mean? But I'd really love it. We're kind of coming close to time. And I think there's a really big conversation around what are the skills that we need and who needs to have them to hold safe spaces of conflict, because I think we're not good at that publicly. And you were talking about earlier about councils possibly being a place where behind the scenes, in the way that social workers can do, talk about, well, what is the issue really? But there's a real skill involved in listening to people say some pretty awful things, holding your integrity, and trying to work out how to keep everyone safe there. It's risky both in terms of how you do that well so the outcome keeps everyone safe, and also I think this is a whole can of worms, too late to open in this conversation really, but in a time of cancel culture, that there's other risks to this as well
Yeah,
that make it really hard, a hard piece of work.
yeah, and that's becoming harder and harder. But I think there's no alternative to finding ways to opening
Mm,
spaces. I mean, we can't. I think the way we have framed social cohesion as sort of a overarching goal in society has always been very harmony oriented. We have to sort of get
mm,
along with each other, but there's a risk that those people who benefit from the current
mm,
that they define where the fault lines are, and they define what it means to get along with each other, and they define
mm.
when we talk about cultural diversity week versus anti-racism. It's
Yeah.
kind of this discussion that who defines. We are not living in an environment, in a political discourse environment where everyone's voice has the same weight. It's unrealistic to do that, and it's
Mm,
also unrealistic to assume that we would all sort of talk a little bit to each other and then we come to a common agreement. We don't have to come to a common agreement. We just have
mm,
to come to a basic understanding where everyone, like the basic needs are met: safety, recognition, belonging,
mm,
things like that's the
mm,
goal. How we get to this will
mm,
always be a conflict-driven environment, and
mm,
sometimes you lose
mm,
an argument, and sometimes you but you don't lose face. You're still
Mm,
part of the process rather than what we see now in the far right. To come back to that, people don't see that they have any voice or any space, although they're actually quite privileged in many ways in terms of having access to public
mm,
conversations. But they just find what Mark Davis and others have called anti-public. You find your own community, whether it's online, often it is online, where you feel like, yeah, they agree with me. And you stay in there, you get your recognition, you get your self-esteem from that. You don't need to engage with the broader public anymore. You
mm,
have given up of political efficacy or that you could change anything. You're just in a little bubble and complain about it. And it becomes really hostile towards
mm,
institutions that have to make some decisions, whether it's government,
mm,
education, or universities or others. They have to do something. But if you say, well, they don't listen anyway, so I'm in my bubble
mm,
and stay there, that's the risk to cohesion, not the arguments and the fights we have, but
mm,
we don't have fights anymore, or we
mm,
all fight in our own little bubbles.
mm. Yeah, we really need a space for public friction, to
That's
be
right.
comfortable with public friction, and to, I guess, trust and have faith that we are seen and heard in a process that is more or less fair in whatever form that looks like. Yeah, I am in that kind of getting stuck in your bubble. I a few years ago we had a real issue where we desperately needed some healthcare for someone, and we couldn't get it. And we're calling the hotlines, and they're sending us around in circles, and the medical clinics weren't open. And for the first time ever, I was like, this is why I would vote for Trump, because I cannot get help. And people are saying, we're a helpful government. It wasn't about Labor or Liberal. It was just, I was ready to burn everything down because no one was seeing that we
Yeah.
desperately needed help. And I was like, that's the first time I'd really interfaced in that way of real systemic failure, which goes to show how privileged I am. But it was a real visceral feeling of invisibility.
Yeah.
So I can see how that slope is
Yeah.
slippery.
And you would know that even if you voted for Trump or whoever you would, it's not the solution, but it is the anger-driven.
And it blows it up.
So I'm not when we look at the current debate in Australia, but also the work that has been done in Trump's America, people who vote are not the beneficiaries of his of that kind of policy. We know that, but it's not about that. And then we rationally driven people, we shake our head and say, well, why?
Mm,
But because we still insist on a certain kind of logic where we think,
mm,
you have there's reason that the facts lead to should make you vote for this or that, but it doesn't work like
mm,
this. People don't
mm,
function like this. Maybe never have, but certainly now less than they did
mm,
30, 40 years ago.
mm. Yeah, and you can see the temptation to just blow it all up and start again. Yeah. So, I mean, we've only got a few minutes really, but we haven't talked about the very specific Australian context at the moment with the increasing popularity of or the visibility of One Nation, Pauline Hanson. I don't really want to give that a lot of airtime, which is why I've saved it for the 2 minutes at the end. But I know a lot of people are just like, what do we do? How do we respond? And what would you say to those people?
Well, at first I am concerned. I find it bizarre how quickly I've never seen anything like this. How quickly the popularity has jumped. I've never seen anything like this I mean, in Germany, it took years and years for the AfD to reach that kind of popularity.
Mm,
So I'm also a bit at a loss there. I think we are tempted to always come to one explanation, and I think that's the risk. And
mm,
there's not one explanation for this. There are many, many different reasons, many different reasons for sort of this allegiance or this tendency towards whether they vote for her or for the party or not. That's a different question, but for saying they will. Um, there's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of, obviously, I think that everyone knows that there's a lot of frustration. Um, the the anti-immigration stance has opened the gates. I think that's pretty clear. And all parties are to be blamed, maybe except for on the very left. But all parties have created a discourse where immigration is seen as a problem that needs to be somehow managed. Even those who say, well, we do manage it well, but it is always sort of something negative that comes to our shore and does something.
mm,
and all parties are responsible for that. So it was easy. We know that from research overseas. Once you take the bait from the right wing, further right wing parties, that you can't elect,
Mm,
you can't win because
mm.
they can always go
Yeah,
further, and
just
they can
snowballs
say
it.
things that in the Liberal Party or in Labour or even in the nation you can't say certain things like what, but you can in One Nation. So
Mm,
there's no chance, and we know that if you take the bait, if you follow that kind of narrative that is set up on the far right or the populist right, you're not, the center is not going to win.
mm,
And that's part of it, the frustration with government, then the structural changes that, the people who, it became permissible or much more socially acceptable now with the change of personnel at One Nation. So a lot has happened at once, the decline of the Liberal Party, lots of things have happened at once, and they have all created those dynamics that have led to that. I
mm,
find as I said, I'm also at a loss to really see this is crazy stuff.
mm.
How this-
But as a kind of to help people, I mean, it's crazy. It's new territory. It's horrifying. As a response to all of this, I mean, I know these are the work, the kind of response work that you talk about is longer term. But it's about, if I've got this right, it's about making sure we have civil society groups and organizations and individuals ready to respond and show up. It's about expanding opportunities for people to connect and have real purpose. And so perhaps that's also about not expecting purity of participation, but allowing belonging in quite a lot of diversity. I think you've also talked about, how we create, well, we have talked about that, creating space for friction and dissenting voices and trusting ourselves to build the skills to hold that, even though it's really hard and we'll probably cry. And I'm sure we'll cry. If you're not crying, we're probably not
Yeah,
doing
we
the
should
work.
probably.
And also that idea of haven't talked about it here, but taking education seriously around democracy and how our processes work, and giving people access to that. And I feel like there, I'll share in the show notes the link to your summary article for people who aren't going to read the whole book, but I actually find them very calming and very grounding and very practical responses, because we can all start to do those things,
Yeah.
tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. And all of us, everyone has a role to play in this. And this is not just a slogan that you throw around, but it's true. And if we and the good thing is that this is not just help, as I mentioned before, it's not just helping us against sort of the rise of illiberal ideologies and groups and extremist groups, but it does a lot. What did you say? The kindness. It makes all our lives in many ways much, much, much better. And addresses many problems at the same time. I don't know why there is not more investment in this. We all know we stare at the problems and then we don't know where to start, but we can start.
Yeah, well, I feel like we've been talking for nearly an hour, and I'd love to keep going because there's so much there. And I do really encourage everybody to check out Mario's work, read the article, read his book. And yeah, I'm just really appreciative of your time and your expertise and your curiosity in this space. It's really important work, and I appreciate it a lot. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Millie. Thanks.